Let's look at the lone survivors in the state Republican Party. It really is the state Senate where 13 Republicans survived this election. There's 11 Democrats. There is a recount this week with Lee Nyquist requesting a recount from with the Andy Sanborn's race. 250 votes in District 9. It's not going to change the picture. Why were they able to hang on? There were two main reasons. The first one deals with redistricting. Senate GOP operative basically told me that 3 Republicans who won last Tuesday would have lost in their old districts had their districts not been made more Republican. Those are Nancy Stiles from Hampton, Russ Prescott from Kingston, and Sam Cataldo from Farmington, who won in an open seat when Fenton Groen decided not to run for re-election. So redistricting was the first reason. As we talked about before, the Senate Republicans under Peter Bragdon, the Senate President, did a pretty good job of redrawing the lines to protect a lot of seats as Republicans, and that's what helped emerge. The other thing that helped them survive was that they rejected some of the House socially conservative agenda. As folks in the pro-abortion rights community told me, they didn't have the kind of roll call votes and kind of bellicose statements against abortion that they had against House members, that they had against Republican executive counselors. So it became very difficult to mount really negative attacks against them in a surgical way. And certainly that's the other reason the state Senate remained Republican. But barely so. After going from 19 to 11, that's a flop of 8 seats, and with a couple of even better Senate Democratic candidates in some of those races, or campaigns that started earlier. Dick Leonard was a good example of that. In District 6, they could have won that seat if he had started earlier. He could have knocked off Sam Cataldo. So the lone survivors on that reality TV show, that's New Hampshire Politics, are the state Senate. Now that we have the House of Representatives flipping from Republican back to Democratic, again for the third time in 4 elections, we've had a switch there. That's what's so amazing. To have Democrats take back control is not so shocking when you think about the fact that the first time they took control in 2006 was the first time in 90 years. And we've seen the House now flip back and forth and back. Certainly I think if you look at how the Democrats were able to win 115 House seats and capture the majority back, there really are 2 major factors. And the first one is all about recruitment. You got to hand it to House Democratic leader Terry Norelli, Democratic Party Chairman Ray Buckley, folks who worked on the House Democratic PAC. They did a phenomenal job of convincing more than 100 Democrats who had lost 2 years earlier to give it another try. Now, a year ago, when the Democratic base in New Hampshire was pretty demoralized, it was difficult to get Democrats to think about dusting themselves off and coming back into the fray. But those Democratic leaders were able to do it, and it really made all the difference, because really what you had in 2012 is you had some familiar Democratic names on the ballot that really helped, because as we've seen in 2012, you got a couple 100,000 more voters that vote in a presidential year. Well, many of those people didn't vote in 2010. They didn't vote to throw out those Democratic members. So they get the ballot, they see the names, and they say, yeah, I know that person. I voted for them in 2008. And they probably won election in 2008. So that certainly helped as well. The other thing that was the undoing for House Speaker Bill O'Brien in losing the majority, ironically enough, was this redistricting plan. Because at the end of the day, it doubled the size of districts, doubled the number of districts from 100 to more than 200. By doing that, you really created smaller places for Democrats to mount door-to-door campaigns. And I think many of them effectively did that. Finally, we certainly had the support of President Barack Obama. Look at the elections, and we'll get a better look at it during the recounts that we're going to have this coming week. But you'll really find that the votes for President Obama track the votes for House candidates. That in many cases, Democrats did as well running for the House of Representatives as the president did in those districts. There was a fall off of the vote, but the percentage was very similar to what they received. So clearly, in that respect, with a 6-point victory, President Barack Obama had some coattails. Now that we've had the legislature elected, it's all about choosing new leadership. And we're certainly going to have new leadership at the top of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. House Speaker Bill O'Brien indicated immediately after the returns were in, he had surprisingly lost the majority in the House, an almost 3-to-1 majority he had received, losing more than 100 seats. He told colleagues that he had no interest in being the House Republican leader, the leader in exile, if you will. I think he's going to go back. He's going to remain in the House. He won his House seat by 70 votes over a Democrat from New Boston. He wasn't the top vote getter in that district. A Democrat was, but he'll be back in the House, but I think devoting more time to his law practice. So we'll see a lot less of Bill O'Brien in the next 2 years, I suspect. But who's going to be the top Republican? Well, we're going to know that fairly soon. Bill O'Brien, not anticipating any challenge to his speakership at the time, scheduled his coronation in the caucus of the Republican Party for the House this coming Thursday, November 15th. So we're going to know who's going to win by then. Very friendly race, but certainly a spirited one between House Deputy Speaker Pam Tucker from Greenfield and former House Speaker, Bartlett Republican Gene Chandler. Lori Sanborn at the end of last week, a newly elected Bedford state representative. She'd been a Henniker representative. The Sanborns moved to Bedford. She had said she's thinking about running. This is not the kind of race you can kind of get into half-hearted. Chandler was the first one out of the gate. Tucker indicated a day later that she was interested too. Bill O'Brien gave a kind of tacit endorsement to her, which should help her. But keep in mind, she lost the race for Republican National Committee woman a couple of months ago. She's not extremely well known among the activist base in the Republican Party. Certainly, we're left with a much smaller Republican caucus and a pretty conservative one. So Tucker might have the edge over Chandler, who's a more moderate, pragmatic leader. But at the end of the day, that person's going to be pretty significant. With about almost 180 votes, they're going to be a player in the next 2 years. And I think I know who Maggie Hassan, the governor-elect, probably would prefer. She'd probably think she could work better with Gene Chandler than with Pam Tucker, who was a devotee of House Speaker Bill O'Brien. We'll see what happens. I'm going to give a slight nod to Gene Chandler in this one, but it could be very close. Only a couple of weeks ago, it wasn't thought possible that there was going to be a real race for Speaker of the House. Well, there is now. The Democrats have taken back control after 2 years in exile with 222 members strong. It's not an overwhelming majority, but it's certainly a solid majority. So now it goes to who's going to win that Democratic caucus vote for Speaker of the House when they meet this coming Saturday at Representatives Hall. I think you have to give an early edge to House Democratic leader and former Speaker Terry Norelli from Portsmouth. She's certainly the better known candidate. She's a known quantity, having been a speaker for 4 years before she was tossed out in 2010. So I'd make her certainly the favorite. I think she worked to help recruit some of these candidates that won for the first time or people who had lost and are now coming back. But she's got a real contest. Dave Chandler, the Nashua Democratic rep, elected to a 6th term in the House of Representatives, is certainly a formidable challenger. And the real question becomes, does this race for Speaker end after the caucus? Dave Campbell has a lot of relations in the moderate Republican wing of the party. And in the kind of even not just moderate wing of the party, but among Republican veterans who have been there a long time. I don't count Bill O'Brien among them. It's not that Bill O'Brien was an enemy of Dave Campbell. I think he thinks fairly well of him, named him to some committees. But many other veteran Republicans who've been here for years, like Dave Campbell, think he's a guy they can work with. And the question is if Dave Campbell comes close in the Democratic caucus of winning, does he then appeal to Republicans to come on board for him for Speaker on the floor of the House and win, just like Doug Scammon did to then House Majority Leader Mike Wally, losing the Republican caucus vote to Wally, only to win the speakership on the floor of the House. That scenario is possible for Campbell, but it really relies on him getting a really strong vote in the Democratic caucus. I think if it's a decisive win for Terry Norelli, I think all Democrats, or almost all, will be encouraged to stick with their leader, even some who voted for Campbell. He's really got to make a serious run at this and get at least 45% of that vote in the Democratic caucus to be a player for Speaker of the House. You know, we had historic victories in last Tuesday's election for women. And it certainly is historic in New Hampshire, when New Hampshire gets all of its congressional delegation being women, the first state in the country where that has occurred. As Annie Custer in the 2nd District and Carol Shea Porter in the 1st District joined both women senators, Kelly Ayotte, the Republican, and Jean Shaheen, the Democrat. And keep in mind, in 2010, those 2 women Democratic senators became the only all-female delegation in the U.S. Senate. That's what's kind of interesting here. Is this is a crowning achievement, certainly for women, with these congressional victories, with the election of a woman governor, Maggie Hassan, the Democrat from Exeter, the second woman elected governor. There actually are 3 women who've been governor. Vesta Roy was Senate president at the time that Hugh Gallen, the Democrat, died in 1970, shortly after the election. In 1980, his election defeat. So Vesta Roy actually was acting governor for a number of weeks before John Sununu took office. But the point I'm really making is 2012 is the cherry on top. Women have been making victories and winning big in New Hampshire for election after election after election. 2006, Carol Shea Porter becomes the first woman elected to Congress from New Hampshire. 2008, Jean Shaheen becomes the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate. 2010, Kelly Ayotte becomes the first Republican woman to be elected to major office in New Hampshire of any kind, and here in 2012. So big win for women. It's no longer news anymore when women win in New Hampshire, and I think it really goes back to our tradition in the legislature of electing some of the largest blocks of women in the whole country. We've always had a high percentage of women in the legislature, and that often becomes a place from which people run for higher office. I think it's one of the reasons why women do well here in New Hampshire, and will continue to. You know, the postmortem of really what happened in the House of Representatives for the Republicans to lose more than 115 seats and to turn the control of the House back to the Democrats, who had held it for 4 years prior to 2010. I think the question I get answered the most is this all about House Speaker Bill O'Brien and the style of leadership that he had that was often confrontational and very conservative, both socially and fiscally. And I think certainly Bill O'Brien's leadership style was a factor in the decisions in the House. Democratic candidate for governor, now Governor-elect Maggie Hassan of Exeter, made Bill O'Brien an issue in her race for governor. She constantly would say on the campaign trail that the Republican nominee, Ovid Lamontagne, who she beat decisively, essentially would follow the O'Brien agenda and would govern in the social and fiscally conservative mold of a Bill O'Brien. And she tried to link the two together throughout the fall campaign. The Democratic Party in New Hampshire, led by Ray Buckley, did a pretty impressive job over the last 15 months of harassing Bill O'Brien, of trying to be the loyal opposition while the party was in exile against many of O'Brien's maneuvers and some of his policy changes, particularly against organized labor and against women. But my experience is New Hampshire voters vote about issues. And on this matter, the O'Brien issues were those that ran against him. As we've talked about in other videos before, I think President Obama was a big help in the Democrats becoming the majority in the House of Representatives. Why do I say that? Because the Obama campaign's re-election strategy was not only about trying to make people distrust Mitt Romney, but also to distrust him on the social agenda, whether it's abortion, contraception, defunding Planned Parenthood. These were all very unpopular to a lot of women voters, and they had an echo here in New Hampshire because Speaker O'Brien was pursuing some of that same policy, allowing business owners not to provide contraception coverage for women, legislation that failed in the state Senate. Trying to defund Planned Parenthood, another bill, failed in the U.S. Senate. And of course, 7 anti-abortion bills that passed the House, and only really 1 that passed the state Senate, which was to ban so-called partial birth abortions. So when the Obama campaign went after Romney, starting 6-8 months ago in the war against women, it really resonated in these legislative races, and caused a lot of people to vote Democratic for president and to vote Democratic for the legislature. I think one of the first, this is Kevin Landrigan at lobbynh.com. I think one of the big first policy questions that comes out of last week's election is, what happens with expanded gambling? That's a very good question. Now, for the first time, as we've talked about before, both political parties nominated a candidate that supported the casino. Democratic Governor-elect Maggie Hassan is on record in this campaign of supporting one casino, one high-end casino that she feels would compete with the 3 casinos that are going to be built in Massachusetts and would prevent a lot of gambling revenue and related hospitality tax revenue from going outside the state. So for the first time, gambling supporters have, so for the first time in more than 10 years, gambling proponents have a friend in the corner office. That makes a big difference. It really does. Last year, the House Republican leadership was kind of agnostic on expanding gambling, really gave it a fair shot. It came within 30 votes of passing the House. It's never passed the House before. But they lacked that executive leadership that would kind of push it along. Now they have it. It's one of the reasons why Republican legislative leaders, at least, tell me privately that they expect Governor-elect Hassan to get a pro-gambling bill on her desk in the next 2 years. Why? Well, for one thing, it's the easiest way to raise revenue. In this state budget that's going to be put together over the next 8 months is going to need more revenue. There's no doubt about it. Even with the economy recovering and with revenue, state revenues coming back into coffers a little healthier, that's not going to be enough to balance the books. They're going to need more money, and certainly raising back the cigarette tax, as Governor-elect Hassan has advocated, gets you $10 million or $12 million, but it doesn't get you what you may need in these next 2 years, which is probably in the order of $100 million, and that's what gambling gets you. It's not a done deal yet, and one of the reasons why it isn't is this race for Speaker of the House. Terry Norelli, the former Speaker, House Democratic leader, and really the favorite to become Speaker of the House, is not a supporter of expanding gambling, has not changed her mind during this campaign. Certainly, I don't think if she became Speaker, would not wield an iron fist to try and block gambling, but would not be helpful to it. And that's the missing ingredient. Is this, as I said before, this issue's never passed the House of Representatives, and one of the reasons why it's never had a speaker in support of it. Now, Dave Campbell, the other speaker candidate in the Democratic caucus, supports expanded gambling. Were he to become speaker, I think that would really increase the odds of this happening. I still think it's better than 50-50 that a gambling bill could become part of the budget discussion and therefore pass. But if a speaker of the House next year supports expanding gambling, you got to raise those odds to 80-20 that it will pass. But we'll watch it here for you at lobbynh.com. Thanks for watching me.